Hey everybody, welcome back to Guns and Gadgets, the premier source for Second Amendment news. Part 2 today of the Freedom Trail in Boston, Massachusetts. I hope you're enjoying this series of videos. I know it's been very enjoyable making them. And again, I want to thank my Patreon supporters for making it all possible. If you want to help support the channel, that information is down below in every video. And without further ado, let's jump into Part 2 of the Freedom Trail in Boston, Massachusetts. All right, everybody, thank you and welcome back to part 2 of the Freedom Trail in Boston, Massachusetts. And when we left off, we were just leaving this building. You can see in this picture here, this is the State House in Boston. But now we're going to draw our attention to the next portion of the trail. Here you see the Park Street Church. Now, most people are drawn to the 217-foot steeple on this church, and it was one of the first landmarks that travelers saw when approaching Boston. What many don't know about the Park Street Church is that this building is where prison reform began. Women's suffrage was a very strong subject that was supported here, and some of the first and most impassioned protests against slavery were delivered inside the walls of the Park Street Church. Now, the site of the Park Street Church is also known as Brimstone Corner because back in the day, the building once housed brimstone, which is a major component of gunpowder, and it used to be stored in the basement during the War of 1812. America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, by Samuel Francis Smith, was first sung here at the Park Street Church on July 4th of 1831. Now, the church also used to be the site of the Granary, which was a place where the colonists stored feed. And that brings us to our next location, which is just next door. This is the Granary Burying Ground. This is a very solemn place. If you come here to Boston, make sure you come to this burying ground. It will leave you speechless. There are some very important people in this cemetery here. Some of the names you all know. There is a discrepancy between the number of headstones and the people buried here in the Granary Burying Ground. There are 2,345 markers. And before I tell you how many people are buried here, the markers have been moved several times. Once there was a what we now call a hurricane, big storm, and some caskets washed downhill. And as a result, they lowered the street, built in a retaining wall to keep the bodies in, and because of that, it's really difficult to know exactly where some of the bodies are buried. Also, the markers were moved again in the advent of the power lawnmower. They were moved to be in rows as opposed to what they were originally. Now, there are, like I said, 2,345 markers here, but it's estimated that there are at least 5,000 people buried here. Over 400 children have been buried inside of the infant's tomb, and since headstones were and still are very expensive, it was very common back then to put several members of one family under one headstone with one name on it. But here you can see dead center. This is the Franklin marker. This is where Ben's family is buried. Now, first off, for those people in Pennsylvania, Ben Franklin was born here in Boston. However, he is buried in Philadelphia because that's where he took his business to when him and his brother started their printing businesses. Of course, his brother went to New York. Now, the first major stone, not that anybody who's buried here isn't important, but the first major one as far as this video is concerned is James Otis. Now, James Otis, as you can see on the marker, was an orator and a patriot of the Revolution. He was also famous for his arguments against writ of assistance. You remember taxation without representation? Well, James Otis was the person who started that argument. Next, we have the tomb of John Hancock. Now, if you follow American history, John Hancock is a name that you should know. He was a prominent patriot during the American Revolution. He served as president of the Second Continental Congress. He was the first and the third governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He's one of the original and the largest signers and signatures on the United States Declaration of Independence. And before the American Revolution, Hancock was one of the wealthiest men in the 13 colonies. He began his political career way back in the day in Boston as a protege of Samuel Adams, and this is where he is buried. The next spot I want to show you here in the Granary burying ground is the burial ground of Paul Revere. Paul Revere, famous for his midnight ride, was also one of America's best silversmiths. He was an engraver, and he was also a dentist. This guy, I don't know how he had time to do anything, but Paul was a very well-known individual. And as you see throughout this video, there's a lot of things dedicated to him here in the city of Boston. And here is where Samuel Adams is buried. Samuel Adams, one of the founding fathers of the United States, a leader of the American Revolution, the second cousin to John Adams, another founding father. He was the fourth governor of Massachusetts, the third lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. He was the president of the Massachusetts Senate. He also had a leading role in the events that led up to the famous Boston Tea Party. He was a very, very influential person. It's safe to say that without this man, a lot of these events that created this country would not have happened. Now, if you have seen part one of this series here, we were in Boston Common, and I showed you the monument to the Boston Massacre. And I mentioned the names Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, and Patrick Carr. Those were the victims of the Boston Massacre, and this is where they are buried. Also buried here at this plot is Christopher Snyder. Now, Christopher Snyder was a 12-year-old boy who was shot and killed by the Tory or loyalist Ebenezer Richardson in Boston on February 22nd of 1770. His funeral became a major political event, and his death heightened tensions that actually erupted into the Boston Massacre on March 5th of 1770. So these six souls here are tied together in history, and as such, they are buried together here at the Granary burying ground in Boston. Now, if you've ever seen Sons of Liberty, they cover this event here where people were outside of the home of Ebenezer Richardson, and he shot a blind shot from the second floor of his home, and that round is what took the life of Christopher Snyder. The next spot along the Freedom Trail here is King's Chapel. Now, King's Chapel is really, really old. It was founded in 1686. The church houses the oldest continually used American pulpit, which was installed over 200 years ago. The belfry of this church holds an original 1816 Paul Revere bell that still rings today. It's absolutely stunning and beautiful inside, and what you see here is called the Governor's Pew. It's the most famous pew in the church. It was reserved for the royal governor and his family, as well as should the king come across the ocean to the colonies, this is where he would go to worship. Adjacent to the King's Chapel is the King's Chapel burying ground. It was erected in 1630. There are several governors and prominent judges and ministers who were buried here, as well as Captain Robert Keene, the first commander of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. That still has a presence in Boston, and it's on the top floor of Faneuil Hall. There's also people who came over on the Mayflower that were buried here, as well as this gentleman, William Dawes. Now, William Dawes should ring a bell with you. He went out with Paul Revere on the Midnight Ride, April 18th to 19th in 1775, to warn everybody that the British troops were out. What they said were the regulars are out. They didn't say the British are coming, because at the time they were all British. But without the actions of this man right here, we would still be British subjects, no doubt. All right, everybody, that's the end of part 2 here of the Freedom Trail. There's a lot of sites here. There's a lot of history. So I'm going to try to keep these videos each to about 10 minutes-ish in length. So it's going to be a multi-part series just because there's so much to see and tell you about, especially for those of us who aren't in the area and can never get to this. So I want to do it right. I want to do these patriots proud. So I hope you understand that we're going to do a couple different parts here. So that's the end of part 2. Let me know what you think down below if you like them. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, link is above and down below in the description. Please check them out. A lot of work goes into this stuff. And thank you again to my supporters and my patrons. You guys and gals have made this series possible. So thank you. Until we see each other again, be safe, stay vigilant, carry a weapon. Keep your eyes open for part 3 coming soon. Take care, everybody.